Hey friends, welcome back to the Journal Feed. My name is Nick Zelt, and this is the only place to get spoon-fed the latest and greatest of emergency medicine. This is the audio version of the past week summaries, which this week were brought to you by our authors, Caitlin Nicholson, Catherine Solkowski, Rebecca DeFabio, and Clay Smith. All right, this week is Stroke Week, so we've got 5 papers on major stroke topics. We're talking big stuff. We're talking unblocking arteries here. Okay, let's go straight to the 4th article, because this is something that you might actually have to do yourself. And then the 4th article, titled Intravenous Tirofiban After Tenecteplase in Acute Ischemic Strokes, the instant randomized clinical trial out of the JAMA. Now, thrombolysis often fails, and that is unfortunate. And the reason for that sometimes might be that giving a thrombolytic could actually promote clot formation. And that's because as the clot breaks down, you're exposing more platelets that from the dissolving clot, and that might actually cause more clotting if there's not enough thrombolytic agent there to continue to break it down. As well as the clot dissolves, you're releasing thrombin and highly activated platelets from the dissolving clot into circulation. And so those might move on elsewhere and cause clotting elsewhere. So there is a possible mechanism for which thrombolysis could actually, worsen some of the clotting. In order to get around this, you would have to deactivate those platelets and try to do so as quickly as possible. And so the thought is that if thrombolysis is failing, it's not working, then maybe if we got an antiplatelet on board as quickly as possible, intravenously enter Tirofiban, which I'd never heard of before, but is apparently an antiplatelet that you can give intravenously, then if we give that quickly after a failing thrombolysis, maybe we'd be able to salvage that thrombolysis because maybe there's too much clot formation as a result of the breaking down of the clot. So we're really trying to help it here. The fear, of course, is more bleeding, which is why typically, while we use dual antiplatelet therapy, DAPT, for a lot of these patients, well, pretty much every patient who has a stroke, we only start it about 24 hours later. In this case, though, maybe if you're failing thrombolysis, it'd be better to give it early. So this was a double-blind RCT, which randomized over 300 patients to get either Tirofiban or a placebo, and starting that Tirofiban within 6 hours of giving the thrombolytic. And only if we're seeing failure of the thrombolytic. And then both groups would be started on aspirin or DAPT at the usual timeframes. And here, at 90 days, we see an increase in the excellent neurological recovery. A modified Rankin score of 0 to 1 at 90 days was 64% versus 52%. That's a number needed to treat of about 9. And that's without any significant change in the rates of bleeding events, complicated symptomatic intracranial hemorrhage, the stuff that we worry about. Now, I don't think this is ready for prime time yet, but it's definitely something to consider and maybe discuss with your neurologist if you did thrombolysis and that patient is not improving. So in a spoonful, when thrombolysis fails, it's possible that if you have Tirofiban and you give that early, you might be able to salvage that failure. And then the 5th article, titled Ticagrelor with aspirin dual antiplatelet therapy combined with intravenous thrombolysis in patients with ischemic stroke in China, the TAPT trial, a multi-center, double-blinded, randomized control trial out of the Lancet. So this is pretty much the same logic, except here we're going to try DAPT instead. In this case with ticagrelor and aspirin. And we're just going to give it earlier than we typically would. So it's the same logic as the last trial, but you're using the medications that we usually use, which are just normal oral antiplatelets. So here they randomized adult patients with NIHSS scores of 4 to 10 who already received thrombolytics within a 4.5 hour typical window. And you're going to start them on DAPT within 6 hours of their stroke onset, which is much earlier than you would typically do for these patients. Because the control group only gets antiplatelets on day 2 after their stroke. And what do we see here? Again, it's all beneficial trials this week, apparently. We see an improvement in the rates of excellent neurological recovery at 90 days, 68% versus 62%. And even for a good modified Rankin scale, 0 to 2, we see that improve as well, 80% versus 75%. We're actually doing quite well. And by the same logic. So I'm not sure if it'd actually be worth it to switch over to Tirofiban, or if you can just give your normal oral antiplatelets just earlier than you would typically give them. And not necessarily only in cases of failed thrombolysis. So there's a lot of things to answer here, but there is potentially benefit of giving much earlier antiplatelets to these patients who get thrombolysis. So in a spoonful, the early start of DAPT in this trial was safe and improved outcomes with moderate to severe strokes. And okay, that's all the 5 articles from this week. Let's do a quick wrap up of everything we talked about. Then from the 4th article, I hadn't heard of Tirofiban before, but it could be safe to give in patients as an antiplatelet for patients who are failing thrombolysis. And finally, from the 5th article, here we saw a number needed to treat of 15 for starting DAPT within 6 hours of stroke onset time in patients who receive thrombolysis to get an excellent neurological recovery. If you were hearing this right now, then you are not a part of the members feed, and so you missed 3 articles from this past week. What were those articles that you missed? Well, we looked at a systematic review and meta-analysis for large strokes and EVT to treat them. And then we looked at, hey, might it be beneficial if we followed up thrombectomy with a little bit of thrombolysis? And then finally, the last article was a trial on EVT for medium vessel occlusions. Is that beneficial, or is it just those large vessels? Links to all the articles can be found at journalfeed.org, or just follow the links in your show notes. Our goal is for you to keep up the easy way through spoon feeding. Thank you.